So, you may have heard this saying, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. For Mosaic Ministries, our main thing is a Christ-centered reconciliation. How do we learn about it? How do we learn to engage in it? And how do we invite others to do this ministry of Christ-centered reconciliation? And for Mosaic Ministries, we often talk about that within biblical understanding of reconciliation, there are largely three dimensions. And it might be good for us to rehearse what those three dimensions are. First is our reconciliation with God above us. What Christ has done for us on the cross enables him to relate to us as his beloved children and no longer as enemies of his, as Romans 5 would remind us. What a tremendous process and a work of reconciliation. That's a vertical one. And then there is a horizontal one. Our reconciliation with one another, and particularly with those people groups with whom you or your people groups have had historical enmity, the division and the conflict. That's the horizontal reconciliation, and Paul reminds us about that reality in Ephesians chapter 2. But then there's a third one that often gets lost, that we don't talk much about, and that is an inward reconciliation between you and yourself. And particularly how the narratives outside of a Christian community often spill in and seeking to define us as you are X, you are Y, you are Z. And often those constructed identities, and starting today we'll be talking about ethnic and racial identities, how those identities have in many ways brought us deep pain, confusion, and angst. But as biblical Christians, we believe that God did not make a mistake when he created each of us as who we are. And part of who I am is that ethnic part. So today we want to explore biblically how might my ethnic identity and my Christian identity intersect. Okay? And in what ways communities like Mosaic or our local churches can imagine our discipleship that would include the category of ethnic identity journey into who we are as a new creation in Christ. Now, as we begin our conversation, I want to start out by mentioning that it seems to me there are two extremes that we should avoid as biblical Christians. One is what I would call ethnocentrism. That notion that I, or we, my people group, are superior than others. And that somehow I or we have more of a God's favor than others. That we are created to be superior. Now, we can think about many historical examples in the past, but if you pay attention to news currently, this supremacy movement of we are better than others beginning to reemerge again and again. And certainly we know the news that we read about, news about white supremacy movements and so forth. But I think when we are very reflective about this and honest about this, it's not just the dominant group that often has this attitude of superiority. Even oppressed people groups, the minority people groups, often also can internalize this feeling or this attitude that our people group is superior than others. So I was born and raised in South Korea. I came to the United States when I was 12 years old. But as I remember the histories that we learned and so forth, as a young boy growing up in South Korea, now many of you know Korea is a small nation, a peninsula, that's surrounded by superpowers of China and Japan and Russia. And in fact, our history is a painful one, constantly being invaded by one of those three. But you know, as oppressed people groups, how they would tell history to young children like me is that other people groups are all uncivilized barbarians. The Japanese, the Chinese, the Russian, we are the civilized people. We are all vulnerable to that kind of attitude of ethnocentrism. But then there is the other extreme that we as Christians need to really think careful about, because this one is becoming more and more commonly shared among evangelical Christians in the United States today. And that notion is, when we become a Christian, we're called to be colorblind. Or to put it differently, why focus on ethnicity and culture and race that can be divisive when we can focus on what unites us, and that is our spiritual identity of being Christians? Right? After all, they would say, Galatians 3:28, in Christ there are no Jews and Gentiles. Or some would go even further and say, your ethnic identity, your culture that you come from, that's part of your old self that you need to just leave behind and strive for this new identity in Christ, our spiritual identity that makes all of us one and the same. There is some aspects of it that's very appealing. But I want to argue today that may not be actually what God calls us to be. So since I already mentioned Galatians 3:28, I want to, in the remaining of our time together, briefly look into the example of Apostle Paul and his teachings. Now, to be sure, when you go to Philippians chapter 3, Apostle Paul says this: as a new follower of Jesus Christ, as a new creation, I no longer think of my being Hebrew of Hebrews, my being so knowledgeable about Jewish law, those things that I used to care a lot about, I'll now consider them a loss to gain Christ. Now, he does say that. But then, does it mean as a follower of Jesus now, Paul no longer sees himself as a Jew? That somehow he is a cultureless person? I would argue he does not. However, what it means to be a Jew, that meaning changes radically, and I want us to think about that. So when we go to Romans chapter 9, I want to particularly read for you verse 2. This one of those honest moments for Paul where he expresses his deep anguish for his people, the fellow Jews, and why they are not turning to the good news of Jesus, and he's lamenting about this. And this is what he wrote in Romans chapter 9, verse 2. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. Oh my gosh. That's usually Paul refrains from that kind of very emotive language. But here he's being very authentic in the middle of the discussion about rich doctrines. I have a great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Here's a Paul saying, he's basically showing this deep, deep sorrow he has in his heart, that I wish I personally would be cursed and thrown away if that would save my people. Yes, he deeply identified with his people, but not in a prideful way, because I'm a Jew, I look down on barbarians, but in a most sorrowful way, because he saw the spiritual condition of his people. Another example. So as you know, when Paul went on missionary journeys, he often went to Jewish synagogues or regular gathering place of Jews, no matter what the city he went to. And he would often begin his ministry there. That was his sort of often go-to place in new missional spots. Again, knowing that he's a Jew, how do I use my Jewish identity for the cause of the gospel? Another example, Ephesians 2, where the church in Ephesus, like many churches in New Testament era, engaged in a deeply, deeply conflicted relationship between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Here, Apostle Paul, as a Jew, Jewish Christian, he's calling two people groups to come together in unity and reconciliation, reminding them both that now, because of what Jesus has accomplished on the cross, we are now brothers and sisters who belong to the same oikos. As a Jew, he was trying to be a bridge builder between Jews and Gentiles. Now, what am I talking about here? Before he became a Christian, like all the other Jews of his time, his Jewishness meant a source of being incredible pride and incredible prejudice towards Gentiles. That he no longer embraces. In fact, he now reinterprets meaning of being a Jew through the lens of the gospel. So that, yes, I am a Jew, but because that's how God has created me to be, I'm going to use even my Jewishness to glorify God and to pursue the cause of the gospel. It is very clear in a Pauline theology, our primary identity as followers of Jesus is that we are a new creation in Christ. That we are now beloved sons and daughters of God. That is our primary identity. That brings us together as one family, right? However, it seems to be, it is equally clear that to Paul, his ethnic identity, that him being a Jewish Christian still mattered. He didn't suppress it, but it had different meaning now. That secondary identity, if you will, may not be as important as his primary identity. Maybe one way to think about it is that our Christian identity is like noun, and my ethnic identity is like adjective, the modifier. But then modifier still matters because it was not accidental, it was not mistake that you and I were created with a particular ethnic, cultural background. And for us, as a journey of following Christ, it is to finding and assigning a new meaning to our ethnic or racial identity as a follower of Jesus. Because we surrender all of our being to the lordship of Christ. Right? So, as I shared earlier, I was born and raised in South Korea, and I came to the United States when I was 12 years old. Now, sociologists, they love to make up new identities for everybody, but they have this identity term called 1.5 generation. So that's me. Now, if you're someone who came to the United States after 18, where you pretty much mastered your mother tongue that is not English, and so you have a difficult time learning a new language or fitting into new culture, you're called first-generation immigrant. If you were born and raised in the United States, even though your parents came from another country, you're called second generation. Now, for those of us who came to the United States somewhere between age of 5 to about 15, because we've somewhat learned our mother tongue in our homeland, but we were young enough to come to the United States and pick up new language, we're called 1.5 generation. So I'm a 1.5 generation Korean American. That's my identity. But you know, growing up, I really disliked that 1.5 part. Because being bicultural, for me experientially, meant that I could never be fully belonging to either side, my Korean side or my American side. And I could never feel like I am accepted by either side. And I often felt I'm basically, again, homeless. Bilingual part, I too did not like that part. To me, the definition of bilingualism means you are incompetent in both. Right? That you are never fully like, this is my mother tongue. This is mine. No, you're constantly learning. Oh God, why have you given me this 1.5 thing that to me is more like a curse? But you know, as I think about my own faith journey and ministry journey, how God has redeemed even that part of me that I always felt like an extra baggage to carry, to allow me to be more effective in carrying out the ministry of the gospel in different settings. Being bicultural taught me how to be comfortable in a place like Mosaic Gathering, where now I come from a particular social location, but I also need to be comfortable in whatever setting God places me. And then bilingual part, who would have known in my age of 58, now God has Trinity start a Korean DMIN program in Seoul, Korea, and now I'm one of the 2 professors going out teaching pastors in Korean language that I'm just fumbling through, right? What is it about your identity, your ethnic, racial identity, including white identity, that may have been a source of pride or pain in the past, that God is redeeming to make you more whole, but also to use you as an effective ambassador of reconciliation? And then what kind of community would enable all God's people from all different backgrounds to be in that journey? So it was exactly 22 years ago when I began teaching on this campus, and at that time I was a PhD student at Northwestern, and Trinity asked me to teach one course as an adjunct professor. But coincidentally, that semester I also was teaching as an adjunct one class at Garrett Theological Seminary on Northwestern campus. Now, many of you know already this. Garrett is a very liberal, progressive, mainline seminary. So on the same day, in fact, I'll be in a one classroom teaching at Garrett, and then get on the car, and 30 minutes later, I'm on Trinity campus. That was a bit of a weird experience, going from one parallel universe to the other, right? Now, but for me, this was what was striking. When I'm at Garrett, they fully embraced me because of my ethnic identity, that I'm a Korean American, minoritized person. But they didn't know what to do with my evangelical convictions. When I come here, they embraced me for my evangelical biblical faith, but they didn't know quite what to do with my Korean American identity. It's as if saying, Peter, come in, but Cha, stay out. Right? Now, fast forward 20 years. I am so grateful that God has, on this campus, created a community like Mosaic Gathering, Mosaic Formation Group, where you are able to bring your whole self and be engaged in conversations. And that ethnic, that racial identity, yes, some of it is a gifts that we share with others, but many of it is a pain that we get to share with others. How do we steward this together as a God's community so that all of us can fully become whom God has created us to be? I believe that is mission not only of a Mosaic learning community, but of all local churches, that are seeking to be the communities of the gospel in today's very diverse landscape in the United States. Now, you have three table questions. Let me read them for you. The first question is, living in today's world of ethnic and racial tensions, how do you relate to your ethnic racial identity? What particular meaning does it have for you? And there are many of our Anglo brothers and sisters. Of course, you're not just white. You come from Polish, Italian, and Irish backgrounds. And many of you know, when they first came to the United States, they faced some stiff discrimination, right? You're part of that family. But then also today, because of racial tensions, white identity is a very significant identity, and I'm glad that we have a book group that is going to meet regularly, talk about this. What meaning does this have for you? But then second, as my message challenged all of us to think about, how would you reinterpret your ethnic and racial identity through the lens of the gospel? And what does that look like for you? And then finally, how might a Christian community like Mosaic Gathering or your local church assist you in the process of redeeming your ethnic identity? Assist you in intersecting your spiritual and ethnic identities, becoming a place where you can really say, Peter, Cha, you're welcomed here. Okay? All right, so let's engage in our table conversation and we'll call you back.